Nowadays, Iraq is mostly known for instability, violence, and being a desert. However, this is the location of the very first civilization 6,000 years ago, Sumer, located in a region known as Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. But what made this place so unique as to be the starting point of civilization itself? Hunter-gatherers have been in this region for a long time before. In the adjacent regions, the Levant and Anatolia, they encountered many grasslands. There must have been abundant food in these grasslands, as 10,000 years ago, when the last ice age had just ended, villages started to be built. Villages too large to be just a single family group of hunter-gatherers. While the first settlements may not have been inhabited year-round, it is likely that people stayed here for long periods, long enough to observe the fundamentals of agriculture, that where plant seeds are left on the ground, new plants grow, and therefore new sources of food. Soon, intentional planting occurs for crops useful for humans. The very first domesticated crops are called the founder crops, and all of them are from the area near the Levant, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. The most well-known crop is without a doubt wheat, of which multiple varieties grew in the wild. Einkorn wheat and emmer wheat were the most important. In the wild, these resemble other grasses, with the wind blowing their grains away in a process known as shattering. The seeds can be released with just a light touch when ripe, but some mutant species don't shatter as quickly when ripe. They retain their seeds for longer, making these grasses better harvestable. But wheat was not the only grass that was domesticated. Another grain was barley. Barley was widespread in the region, growing in the Levant, southern Anatolia, and the Zagros Mountains. More drought and salt-resistant than wheat, it was an ideal grain crop in arid climates like southern Mesopotamia. Other plants that were early domesticated were the lentil, pea, and chickpea. These plants underwent a similar mutation as the grains. The wild species have pods that scatter open when ripe, but the domesticated plants stay closed. The last founder crop was flax. Flax was also widespread in the same regions, initially used as an oil crop, but the sturdy fibers also proved useful for textiles and clothing. These six are the founder crops, the first domesticated species: wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, and flax. Together, these crops can sustain communities. However, it is not very varied, and likely ancient communities gathered additional food elsewhere for thousands of years after domestication. When humans first domesticated crops, they were still reliant on hunting for meat. They favored gazelle, aurochs, ibex, and mouflon. Successful attempts to temporarily tame these four animals happened. As they live in herds, multiple animals can be held together in close proximity. Domestication was eventually successful for three of these species. Aurochs became cows, ibex became goats, and mouflons became sheep. The central location helped the communities there get access to more crop types. Crops domesticated in Arabia, Egypt, Southern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia could be transported to Mesopotamia and be grown there. In Arabia, date palms were domesticated, and they were later also grown in Mesopotamia. In Egypt and Nubia, watermelons were likely domesticated. In Southern Europe, olives and plums. In the Caucasus, apples, pomegranate, lettuce, and hemp for textiles were domesticated. In Central Asia, onions and garlics, as well as pistachio nuts, were first grown. And in the southern Levant, fig trees were also domesticated. The number of available crops were much larger at 4000 BC compared to 10,000 BC, when the first six founder crops were initially domesticated. Of course, availability of crops was not the only advantage Mesopotamia had. Another plus was its climate. In the winter, freezing temperatures are rare. It is cold enough for a dormant season, which means that new crops can be sown and sprouted before insects became active again and eat the young plants. In summer, Temperatures get very high, which results in a strong growth rate for plants as the sun gives a lot of energy. The only disadvantage here is the rainfall, which is basically none at all in the summer. But the Mesopotamia region has a solution for that rainfall problem. In fact, it has two: the Tigris and the Euphrates. That is why it's named the land between the rivers, as the marshlands between these rivers gave the crops in summer the combination of plentiful water and sunlight. The source of these rivers is southern Anatolia, which has a Mediterranean climate. Every winter, rain falls, feeding the rivers, and snow falls in the mountains. By spring, the snow melts and water is carried downstream, causing flooding of the river valleys. The water erodes the soil upstream and deposits that downstream, fertilizing the valleys. This flooding is also mostly dependable and regular every spring. This combination of sun, water, and fertile soil resulted in agricultural yields that were far higher than anywhere else, and a food surplus is the basis of civilization. For priests, artisans, traders, and others to be viable, farmers must produce food for more people than just themselves. The villages did not only exist near the river, but also inland in the plains between the rivers. The large-scale construction of canals for irrigation necessitates cooperation between communities. Many large and small canals were dug. These are the canals of Eridu, showing the complexity of the irrigation system. These canals also have to be maintained, as erosion and silting would otherwise destroy them. Central authorities were likely required for this maintenance. The combination of the food surplus and the necessity of cooperation resulted in the first cities being founded here in Sumer. 6,000 years ago, around 4000 BC, Uruk was likely the largest settlement in the world, with estimates of up to 4,000 residents. Sumer was dominated by city-states. Other city-states were Ur, Eridu, Lagash, and Kish. The city of Uruk yielded significant influence on the surrounding countryside. Farmers around Uruk would donate food to the temples in Uruk as a gift to the gods, and would get artisanal goods in return, pottery and bronze items unobtainable for farmers. The temples and priests yield a strong influence on society, though it's not like these farmers could refuse, as a city like Uruk has sufficient military might to coerce them. The farmers, however, did genuinely believe in their religion, and it's unlikely that violence was necessary. While Sumer was a land of plenty for agricultural yields, it lacked certain other resources, the most obvious of which is wood. There are no big natural forests in the river delta and the desert. Wooden houses would not be built here, and cooking with wood is also unlikely. Other sources of carbon would be burned instead, such as dried dung or the plentiful reeds from the river shores. These reeds could also be used to build housing for the poorer part of the population. The cities were made from bricks, rather than wood or reeds. The ground in Sumer contains few rocks and no minerals, but plentiful clay. Water can be added to the clay to mold them into shapes, and in the strong summer sun can be dried and hardened. In the summer, when you lay these bricks in the sun, during noon, temperatures of 60 to 70 degrees can be reached, enough to harden them. These sun-dried clay bricks formed the basis of construction in the cities. The cities are divided into multiple districts, one of which is the temple district. There are huge temples such as the well-known ziggurats. These use the more expensive kiln-baked clay bricks. Regular houses instead use sun-dried clay bricks. Plentiful clay was also used for pottery. Many kinds of pottery have been found from this time period. Pottery tended to be made with a human-powered pottery wheel. Ceramics were used for storage and transport, but also to make small statues of gods and kings. In Sumer, the world's first writing system was also developed. Symbols were written on clay tablets using reeds to make markings. The tablets were then dried in the sun to make the writings permanent. At first, the symbols described objects and a numbering system used for accounting and transactions. Over the centuries, the symbols grew more abstract and a true writing system formed by 30,000 BC. Many clay tablets have been found from this period, most of which describe transactions. But the world's oldest complaint is also on these tablets, with many complaining about Ea Nazir, a merchant now infamous for selling poor copper. They also contain old jokes such as, a dog walks into a bar, his eyes do not see anything, he should open them. Tablets also contains recipes, both for cooking and metallurgy, as well as stories such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and words of wisdom such as, the dog understands take it, but it does not understand put it down. The original no take, only throw meme. The city of Uruk, around 4000 BC, existed in a transition period from the Copper Age to the Bronze Age. While ancient Sumer had plentiful food, water and clay, one thing they lacked was much mineral wealth, and therefore they had no source of copper of their own. However, most of their neighbors do have access to copper. There are ancient copper mines in the Sinai and the eastern desert of Egypt, on the island of Cyprus, all around Anatolia, in the Zagros Mountains in Persia, and in Arabia on the Red Sea coast, as well as Oman. As the only major population center without access of their own, specialized merchants were necessary to ensure access to copper, which is another reason for states to emerge. A small independent village won't be able to support merchants on their quest for copper, nor would they be able to give meaningful mediums of exchange. Local people were usually paid in barley or beer, but long-distance trading was done using copper. Copper is one of the few elements that can occur in pure form in nature, unalloyed and directly usable, like silver and gold, which can also be found in metallic form. This is the reason these metals were known in ancient times. But unlike silver and gold, copper also often occurs as oxides or sulfides that require purification. In video games, this appears easy, you just mine some copper ore and smelt it. In ancient reality, it was not nearly as simple. The very first step, mining it, is already very dangerous using ancient tools. Being sent to the mines was a death sentence in ancient times, as usually done by enslaved or convicted people. If you get the copper ore out, the next problem is getting the copper itself out. That was not just a matter of putting it in a furnace. The problem when trying to cast or purify copper is its melting point, 1080 degrees Celsius. Wood burns at 800 degrees. It cannot melt copper. Wood contains water and impurities that stop it from getting hot enough to melt copper. In order to remove these, you need to heat up the wood enough to remove the water, without burning the wood itself in the process. This forms charcoal. In order to make charcoal, one makes a big pile of wood, as densely packed as possible. This is then covered to make it airtight, except for a hole on the top, where dried hay, straw, and leaves are placed. This is then ignited. In this process, some of the wood is burned to dry the rest of the wood. The excess of air is tightly controlled. Too much and your wood burns to ashes. Too little and the fire goes out. This burning goes on for a long time. You are talking in a scale of days. After the process is complete, charcoal is formed. In order to produce 1 kilogram of charcoal, 3 to 4 kilograms of wood are necessary. Copper oxides are the easiest to purify. They need no pretreatment before smelting the copper using charcoal. To smelt it, you bury the copper in the ground and light charcoal on top of it, so that the heat of the charcoal near the copper does not get cooled by the air. This is a pit furnace. For other copper minerals, such as copper sulfides, a roasting step must first be performed. The copper is heated up to remove sulfur and water from the minerals. This step does not need charcoal. Wood burns hot enough for this. After you get pure copper, if you want to smith it into shapes, you need even more charcoal to heat up the metal to soften it. As you can see, ancient metallurgy requires a lot of wood. Ancient communities must also have noticed that not all copper is equal. Some copper melts easier than others, while the resulting metal is also stronger. This is arsenic bronze. Some copper mines had arsenic as an impurity, and it resulted in easier handling and stronger metal. But it did come with a small drawback. Arsenic is incredibly toxic. But there is another element that, when mixed with copper, gives a similar result. Tin. Tin is much less toxic than arsenic and actually gives even better results. It's also easier to cast and smelt. This is a phase diagram. On the y-axis, you see the temperature, and on the x-axis, the amount of tin in your copper. This line is the melting point of the mixture. As you add more tin, the melting point goes down. The ideal amount of tin is 10%, which results in a melting point of about 1000 degrees, which is easier to reach than the almost 1100 degrees for pure copper. If you don't add enough tin, your bronze is not as strong and the melting behavior is more difficult. If you add too much tin, your metal becomes brittle and it cannot be used for any purpose where it must resist impact. No axes for woodcutting, no hammers for smithing, no weapons nor armor. It results in just a static bronze. Another problem of using too much tin is the price. Tin is much rarer than copper, and you can see that the amount of ancient tin mines is low. There's a small tin mine in Anatolia and one in Egypt, but these only satisfy local needs and were too small for trading. The larger mines were further away, in northern Iberia, Brittany, southern Britain, and Afghanistan. As you can imagine, getting this to Sumer in the Bronze Age is no cheap task. This tin is moved by a series of merchants, each selling it a moderate distance further and charging a premium. By the time this reaches Sumer, a lot of upcharges are included. In order to afford this, Sumer had to export plentiful textiles, ceramics, leather, oils, dyes, and agricultural surplus. Another reason why cooperation was so important in ancient Sumer, in order for living to actually work for the people here, cooperation was required. The agricultural surplus enabled a class of people that were not involved in agriculture and made the first city possible. The irrigation canals required large-scale effort to build and maintain, and the lack of certain resources, combined with the surplus of others, made it possible for a centralized command to establish themselves to fill in the gaps of the lacking resources. The ancient people of Sumer formed the first state not because they liked the idea, but out of necessity.